The dust hangs in the air like a living thing. The screaming has stopped, replaced by something worse, silence. A Spartan warrior lies against the rocks, his armor dented, his right arm gone below the elbow. His breathing is shallow. Around him, bodies, Persian bodies, Greek bodies. The distinction doesn't matter anymore. They're all just meat on stone. Above, the sun is merciless. The air tastes like iron and smoke. An arrow, a single arrow, falls from the sky and embeds itself in the Spartan's chest. He doesn't even flinch. His eyes remain fixed on the mountain pass ahead, on the path where his king fell hours ago. Or was it days? Time has become meaningless in this gorge of death. This place the Greeks called Thermopylae. The hot gates. More arrows fall. Hundreds of them. Thousands. They blacken the sky like a plague of locusts, and the Spartan warrior closes his eyes. Not from fear, not from pain, but because he finally understands what his entire life was meant for. This moment, this death. But the real story, the one they never told you, is far darker than the legend. For over 2,000 years, we've celebrated the Battle of Thermopylae as the ultimate act of heroic sacrifice. 300 Spartans holding back the incomprehensible Persian horde. But what if we've been wrong? What if the myth was propaganda? What if the truth behind those hot gates is so much more complex, so much more human, and so much darker than anything Hollywood ever showed us? Today, we're excavating the real Thermopylae from beneath the romantic rubble of history. We're going to meet the brutal culture that created these warriors. We're going to stand in the pass where thousands died. We're going to face the betrayal that doomed them all. And most importantly, we're going to discover what actually happened when the most powerful empire on Earth collided with a handful of men who chose death over surrender. This is the story of the 300. This is the dark truth. Before we can understand Thermopylae, we have to understand Sparta. And Sparta was not a place for the weak. Imagine a society that takes your son from your arms at age 7 and never gives him back. That's Sparta. The moment a Spartan boy reached 7 years old, he was taken from his mother by the state. And yes, taken is exactly the right word. It was a seizure, a kidnapping sanctioned by law. The boy entered the agoge, a system of training so brutal that modern people struggle to comprehend it without becoming uncomfortable. The goal was simple: transform boys into weapons. Not soldiers, not warriors, weapons. Living, breathing instruments of death who feared nothing and questioned nothing. The agoge had no mercy. Boys were deliberately underfed so they would learn to hunt and steal. They were whipped in front of the temple of Artemis until blood ran down their backs, and crowds would cheer if they didn't cry out. Pain was a teacher. Fear was a weakness to be beaten out. Mercy was an illness to be cured. By the time a Spartan boy reached his teens, he'd been hardened into something almost inhuman. He'd lived outdoors most nights. He'd learned to kill with his bare hands. He'd internalized the idea that individual life meant nothing, that only the collective mattered, that glory and death were the same thing, that victory and honor were written in blood. Leonidas lived through this. Born around 519 BCE to King Anaxandridas, he was a prince, yes, but that meant little in Sparta. The agoge didn't care about your bloodline. It devoured everyone equally. Young Leonidas watched his half-brother die in training, watched his cousins disappear into the mountains, never to return, watched weak boys simply vanish, their fates unspoken. This was normal. This was Sparta. By the time Leonidas reached adulthood, he was no longer fully human in the way we understand it. He was a monument to an ideology. His entire existence was dedicated to the collective power of Sparta. His body was not his own. His life was not his own. His wife, and he did marry for breeding purposes, his wife Gorgo knew better than to expect emotional attachment. That was weakness. But something crucial happened in Leonidas' mind during those years of transformation. Somewhere beneath the conditioning, beneath the ideology, he developed something more dangerous than blind obedience. He developed honor, purpose, a genuine belief in what Sparta stood for. And that made him exponentially more dangerous than any mere tool. When Xerxes crossed the Hellespont in 480 BCE with his massive army, every Greek city received the same message. surrender or die. The Persian Empire was not offering negotiation. It was offering a choice between slavery and annihilation. And most of Greece chose slavery. They sent their representatives to Persia. They submitted to the great king. It was practical. It was rational. It was the survival instinct of a small civilization facing an overwhelming tide. But Sparta refused, not because they had any real chance of winning. They refused because Sparta's entire society was built on a lie they absolutely believed: that they were superior, that 10 Spartan warriors could defeat 100 ordinary men, that Spartan courage transcended human limitations. And Leonidas? Leonidas embodied that lie so completely that he began to live as though it were truth. When the ephors, the 5 magistrates who truly governed Sparta, asked Leonidas to lead the Greek resistance, he already knew it was likely a suicide mission. But suicide and martyrdom aren't the same thing in Sparta. One is defeat. The other is the ultimate victory. Leonidas would go to Thermopylae not to win, but to demonstrate that Sparta was unconquerable. He would go to make a statement written in bodies and blood, and that statement would reverberate through Greek culture for 2,000 years. Now, on the other side of the known world, Xerxes sat atop his throne and contemplated conquest. The man we imagine as this cosmic demon, this avatar of tyranny and empire, was actually far more interesting than that. Xerxes was born into power without question. He was the son of Darius the Great, a man who had conquered more territory than anyone alive. The weight of that expectation, the weight of inheriting the largest empire on earth, shaped Xerxes' entire worldview. Xerxes was pragmatic. When Greek envoys came to him with submission, he accepted their gifts and their fealty. He saw no reason for conflict. The Greeks were distant, disorganized, primitive. They would fall in line like everyone else. The Persian system worked because it was reasonable. It didn't demand that conquered peoples abandon their gods or their customs. It just demanded obedience. It demanded taxes. It demanded acknowledgement that Xerxes was superior. To Xerxes, this was obvious and natural. Everyone was inferior to the great king. That was simply how the world worked. But Sparta's refusal? That was an insult. Not a military threat, an insult. Sparta rejected not just Persian rule, but the very premise that anyone could tell them what to do. This was not something Xerxes had experienced before. Every other kingdom either submitted or was destroyed. Neither had questioned the great king's authority itself. So Xerxes decided that Sparta needed to be made an example of. They would be the ones to demonstrate what happened when you refused the will of the Persian throne. The invasion force Xerxes assembled was staggering. Later Greek historians claimed 1 million men. Modern estimates suggest somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000. The actual number probably doesn't matter. The point is that it was incomprehensibly large. This wasn't an army. It was a migration. It was a civilization on the move with siege equipment, supply trains, engineers, cavalry, archers, infantry. It came from Mesopotamia and Egypt and the far reaches of the Persian domain. Persians, Egyptians, Lydians, Phrygia, Thracians, Dacians, and 100 other peoples unified under the twin banners of conquest and the fear of their master. Xerxes himself traveled in a golden chariot. His tent was a palace. He had tasters who sampled his food in case of poison. He had concubines and advisors and generals and scribes recording his every movement for posterity. He was a man so accustomed to absolute power that he couldn't imagine a world where his will wasn't instantly obeyed. And when he crossed into Greece, he brought all of that power with him. The Persian army was a tsunami of bronze and flesh, and the Greeks watched it approaching like people watching the weather, helpless, terrified, waiting for the inevitable impact. The Greek response was pathetic. The city-states sent small contingents. Athens sent some ships. Thebes sent men. Corinth, Megara, Phocis, they all contributed something. But most of Greece submitted without a fight. They'd already done the calculus. Sparta couldn't win. No one could win. The only question was whether you fought and died or submitted and lived. But Leonidas was not interested in calculus. He was interested in meaning. He was interested in creating a moment so profound, so defiant, that it would echo through the centuries. He gathered his best men, the royal guard, the elite of the elite. And yes, there were 300 of them. Not because 300 was some magical number, but because that's how many the Ephors permitted him to take. And alongside these 300 Spartans, he brought contingents from other Greek cities. Maybe 7,000 in total. The exact number is lost to history, but it was maybe 7,000 Greeks against perhaps 250,000 Persians. The math wasn't complicated. The Greeks were going to die. Before Leonidas left Sparta, there's a moment that deserves our attention. He was with his wife, Gorgo. We know very little about Gorgo except what later Greek historians decided to report. She was likely young. She was definitely educated by Spartan standards, which meant she was far more educated than the women of other Greek city-states. In Sparta, women had unusual freedom. They owned property. They could divorce. They could speak their minds. Gorgo was not a helpless queen waiting passively for her husband to return. When Leonidas told her he was going to Thermopylae, Gorgo understood what he was telling her without him needing to say it. He was telling her he wasn't coming back. And she looked at her husband, this man she'd been raised alongside from childhood, never allowed to love in the way we understand it, but bound to by duty and culture, and she asked him a single question. Come back with your shield, or on it. In Sparta, shields were sacred. A soldier who lost his shield in battle was considered a coward. To come back with your shield meant to come back victorious, with your weapon and your honor intact. To come back on your shield meant to come back dead, carried home by your brothers. There was no third option. There was no surrender. There was no compromise. Gorgo was telling her husband, be victorious or be dead. She wasn't asking him to survive. She was asking him to mean something. Leonidas marched north with his men, and they moved toward Thermopylae with a strange sense of purpose. The other Greek allied forces joined them along the way. The road to Thermopylae was a pilgrimage, and those Spartans knew it. They were walking toward their destiny. Some were probably exhilarated. Some were probably terrified. Most had probably transcended both emotions into a kind of grim acceptance. This was what they'd been trained for since childhood. This was the meaning they'd been searching for their entire lives. When they arrived at Thermopylae, they finally understood the gift they'd been given. The Hot Gates were a narrow coastal pass, no more than a few hundred meters wide in places, squeezed between mountains and the sea. It was a place where numbers meant nothing. It was a place where 300 warriors could hold against thousands because only a few hundred enemies could engage them at any given moment. The geography turned a suicide mission into something resembling a fair fight. Not a fair fight exactly, but the kind of fight where courage and discipline could matter. Leonidas positioned his men across the pass. The Spartans held the center, the strongest position. The other Greek hoplites, the heavily armored infantry, lined the flanks. The walls of the pass rose around them like a natural fortress. There was fresh water. There was defensible ground. And most importantly, there was hope. Maybe they couldn't win, but they could hold. They could make Xerxes pay in blood for every meter of ground. On the first day, the Persians attacked with their best troops. Not the immortals, Xerxes' personal guard, but elite soldiers nonetheless. The Persian army had probably never seen anything quite like a Spartan phalanx. The Greeks formed up in tight formation, shields overlapping, spears extended. They weren't interested in individual heroics or dramatic sword fights. That's not how they fought. The phalanx was a collective entity. Each man protected the man to his left. Each man was protected by the man to his right. It moved forward with the inexorable momentum of an avalanche. It was a formation designed to crush, not to dazzle. The Persians charged, and they were met with a wall of bronze and spear points. The sound alone must have been like nothing either side had ever experienced. The crash of thousands of bodies colliding, the screams of the dying, the roar of men pushing harder, trying to maintain their formation while their brothers were bleeding out at their feet. The Persians broke. They retreated. They'd never seen infantry that didn't panic, that didn't break formation, that didn't run. The Spartans held their line and actually advanced, pushing the Persian soldiers back into their own ranks. For the first time, the Persians realized that the Greeks weren't going to simply collapse. Something was wrong with their calculations. Something was wrong with the fundamental assumption that size and numbers always equal victory. Xerxes sent more troops, this time with cavalry. The cavalry charges were supposed to break the Greek line by sheer impact, by the weight and terror of horses moving at speed. But the Spartans had formed in a position where the horses couldn't charge at full gallop. The terrain was broken. The space was too narrow. The cavalry was nearly useless. The Persians sent them in anyway, and they died screaming, crushed by the relentless Greek spear line. By the end of the first day, hundreds of Persians were dead. The Greek losses were minimal. Word spread through the Persian camp like a plague. The Spartans weren't human. They couldn't be killed. They didn't break. They didn't surrender. They didn't run. This wasn't war. It was something else entirely. Xerxes consulted with his generals. They needed a new strategy. Frontal assault wasn't working, so they tried something different. They started sending wave after wave of soldiers in endless rotation, hoping to wear the Greeks down through pure attrition. Soldiers would attack for a time, then retreat and let fresh soldiers take their place. The Greeks wouldn't have that luxury. Every warrior they lost was gone forever. On the second and third days of fighting, the battle became a grotesque grinding machine. The Persians would advance in waves. The Greeks would hold. Neither side was gaining ground in any meaningful way. Instead, the mountain pass was slowly filling with bodies. The water ran red. The smell of death became so overwhelming that men fought in a miasma of their own dying. Heat exhaustion set in. Hunger. Thirst. Exhaustion so complete that soldiers began fighting in a kind of waking nightmare, running on pure reflex and training while their minds had simply shut down. But during these days, something crucial was happening. A man named Ephialtes was watching from the Persian side. He was a local Greek, possibly from the nearby region. He knew the land. And more importantly, he knew something that the Greeks had hoped no one would know. There was a goat path, a trail that went around the mountain pass. A path that would allow the Persians to outflank the Greek position entirely and come down from the mountains behind them. The Greeks would be trapped. Ephialtes made contact with the Persian general Hydarnes and offered him this information in exchange for a reward. And Hydarnes, perhaps against his better judgment, believed him, because the information made too much sense. It explained how the Greeks could be defeated. It explained how a frontal assault that was failing could be transformed into a victory. Hydarnes took Ephialtes' offer seriously. On the third day, as the sun began to set, Leonidas received news that would change everything. Persian soldiers had been spotted on the mountain path above them. Hydarnes had taken Ephialtes' offer and sent a force to circle around. The Greek position was about to be surrounded. They had perhaps a few hours before the Persians came down from behind and crushed them in a vice. Leonidas called his commanders together and made a decision that would cement his legend for all of history. He would stay. The Spartans would remain in the pass to hold the line and give the other Greeks time to escape. It wasn't a retreat disguised as a noble last stand. It was a genuine sacrifice. He was choosing, in that moment, to transform a strategic defeat into a spiritual victory. He was choosing meaning over survival. According to later accounts, and remember, many of these accounts were written by people who loved the Spartans and wanted them to seem as heroic as possible, Leonidas gave a speech. The exact words are lost to time, but the sentiment probably went something like this. They had come to Thermopylae not to win, but to show that Sparta was unconquerable. They had already done that. The other Greeks had seen that Spartans don't break. They don't flee. They don't surrender. Now they needed to make sure that lesson was taught so thoroughly that it would never be forgotten. Some soldiers would leave. That was necessary. But the 300, the core of the guard, would remain. And they would fight until the end. Not all the troops left. Around 700 Thespians, Greek soldiers from the city of Thespi, decided to stay with Leonidas. They could have left. They could have survived. But they looked at these Spartans who had decided to die for a principle, and they decided that their own lives were worth less than being part of that moment. So they stayed. Through the night, Leonidas' remaining force held the pass. The Persians tried some night assaults, probing attacks to test the Greek line. But in darkness, the advantage shifted even more toward the Greeks. The narrow pass meant that the Persians couldn't use their superior numbers. Close combat in darkness negated the mobility of cavalry. The Greeks held. When dawn came, Hydarne's flanking force was moving through the mountains behind the Greek position. The trap was closing. Leonidas knew this. He probably knew it was almost over now. But he still positioned his men, still prepared the defenses, still made sure that every soldier understood that they were going to do this thing. They were going to die on this pass, and they were going to die fighting. They were not going to be slaughtered like animals. They were going to face their death the way Spartans were taught to face death, with courage and discipline. The last phase of the battle was apocalyptic. The Persians attacked from the front with renewed intensity, sensing that victory was finally within reach. And at the same time, word came that the flanking force was visible from the mountains. The Greeks were being surrounded. The end was coming. In the chaos and blood of those final moments, Leonidas was killed. Exactly how he died, we don't know. Ancient accounts vary wildly. But what we do know is that he fell and his body was fought over. The Persians wanted to kill him twice, wanted to dishonor his corpse by desecrating it. The Greeks fought to keep his body, to protect it, to prevent it from being defiled. It's a strange detail, but it speaks to something profound about honor cultures. Your body mattered. What happened to it after death mattered. The struggle for Leonidas' body became a kind of final battle within the battle. When the Greeks finally lost, they regrouped on a small hill called Kolonos. They formed one last phalanx, one last line. The Persians came in waves, and the Greeks held their shield wall and thrust their spears out into the Persian ranks. Men fell. More men came. The Greeks held. There's an account from Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian, that says the fighting was so desperate that at one point the Greeks were fighting with broken spear shafts and even bare hands. That the Persian soldiers had to be pushed forward by their own officers with whips because they were terrified to engage these seemingly unkillable warriors. Finally, it was just over. There were no more Greeks fighting. The pass was quiet except for the sound of the Persian army tending to its wounded, counting its dead. Xerxes surveyed his victory and found that thousands of Persians had died to take a narrow mountain pass. He'd lost maybe 1 out of every 4 soldiers sent against that position. By any conventional military standard, this was a failure. The cost was too high. The Greeks had extracted a price that should have been unacceptable. But Xerxes wasn't thinking in conventional military terms. He was thinking in political terms. He'd ordered the Greeks to surrender. They'd refused. He'd brought the most powerful army on earth to crush them. And yes, they were crushed, but not before they demonstrated that the Persian army could bleed, that it could take losses, that it could be hurt. Over the following days, Xerxes pressed on to Athens. The city was evacuated. The Persians burned it to the ground. It seemed like Xerxes had won. The great Persian conquest of Greece was proceeding as planned. But he was wrong. The plan was already failing, and he didn't know it yet, because something had changed at Thermopylae. Something had shifted in the Greek consciousness. Yes, they'd lost the battle. Yes, they'd been forced to retreat. But they'd also discovered that the Persians could be hurt. They'd seen that resistance was possible. And more importantly, they'd seen that 300 men could hold against the supposed unlimited power of the great king. That single fact that David could bloody Goliath was worth more than any military victory. When the Persians tried to consolidate their control of Greece, they found a population that was no longer afraid. The Greeks fought at Salamis and destroyed the Persian fleet. They fought at Plataea and defeated the Persian army on land. Within a year, the great Persian invasion had been turned back. Within a generation, the Persian Empire would begin its slow decline. And it all traced back to that narrow mountain pass where a handful of men chose death over surrender. Now here's where the real complexity begins. Here's where the legend and the reality start to diverge. The Spartans, immediately after Thermopylae, moved into a position of leadership in the Greek coalition against Persia. They become the great heroes of Greek resistance. The story of Leonidas and the 300 becomes enshrined in Greek culture as the ultimate tale of heroism and self-sacrifice. And it's taught that way because it serves a purpose. It serves the Spartan purpose. You see, the truth is that the Battle of Thermopylae was, in many ways, a political event as much as it was a military event. The Spartans didn't send Leonidas and the 300 primarily because they thought it was militarily necessary. They sent them for the same reason they'd started the whole resistance to Persia in the first place. Because refusing to bow down to the Persian great king was a matter of Spartan identity. Because Sparta's entire society was predicated on the idea that they were a warrior culture superior to any other. Because submitting to Xerxes would have been ideological suicide. But here's the dark part. Not everyone in Sparta agreed. There was a faction within Sparta that thought submission to Persia was the practical choice. That thought alliance with Persia would be profitable. That thought the cost of resistance was too high. Leonidas himself was not universally supported in his decision to march north. Some in Sparta thought he was being reckless. This is why the myth of Thermopylae became so important. It justified everything. Proved that Sparta was right to resist. It proved that Spartan warriors were incomparable. It proved that their society, for all its brutality and strangeness, had been proven correct by history itself. The 300 became propaganda, the most effective propaganda Greece had ever created. And that's not to diminish what actually happened at Thermopylae. The battle was real. The casualties were real. The choice Leonidas and those 700 Thespians made was real. But the way it was remembered, the way it was used, the way it shaped the entire course of Greek history, that was a political act. The legend became more powerful than the event it commemorated. Modern historians have tried to untangle the historical Thermopylae from the legendary one. They've looked at ancient sources, Herodotus and Plutarch and Pausanias, and they've tried to parse what actually happened from what was added later for narrative effect. And what they've found is that the broad strokes are probably accurate. There was a battle. The Greeks held a narrow pass. They were outflanked. They died rather than retreat. All of that is likely true. But the details? Those have been shaped and reshaped by centuries of retelling. The exact number of Greeks who died probably wasn't 300 Spartans plus 700 Thespians. It was probably more. Probably considerably more. We just don't know because the numbers were lost to time and embellishment. The way the battle progressed, whether it was a multi-day grinding affair or a faster engagement, that's been disputed by historians. The role of Ephialtes has been debated. Was he a genuine traitor? Or is his role a later invention designed to provide an explanation for the Greek defeat? And here's the thing that modern historians don't like to talk about much, but it's true. The Spartan victory at Thermopylae would eventually become the foundation for Spartan imperialism. Over the next few decades, as the Persians were pushed back, Sparta became the dominant military power in Greece. And Sparta used that power to dominate other Greek cities. They installed puppet governments. They demanded tribute. They became, in many ways, as oppressive and imperial as the Persians they claimed to have resisted. The Spartans even briefly allied with Persia later in history to maintain their power over other Greek states. The very same Persia that Leonidas had died resisting. The very same Xerxes whose army the Spartans had bloodied at Thermopylae. History is not a fairy tale where the heroes remain heroes after their victory. History is messier than that. History is more complex. But does that complexity negate what happened at Thermopylae? Does it make the sacrifice any less real? Not really. What it does is force us to understand the battle for what it actually was. A real moment of real human courage and real human horror, used for real political purposes by real people who understood that the way history is remembered matters as much as what actually happens. Leonidas went to Thermopylae not because he was certain he would win. He knew he wouldn't. He went because he understood that sometimes the point of an action isn't the outcome. Sometimes the point is the meaning. Sometimes the point is the legacy. And he was willing to die to create a moment so powerful that it would reshape the course of civilization. The Spartans who followed him had been raised their entire lives to understand that this was possible. That death in service of the collective, death for the sake of honor and ideology, was not just acceptable, it was the highest form of life. They were the ultimate expression of a society that had successfully, completely, utterly removed the individual from the picture and replaced it with the collective. And in that moment at Thermopylae, facing an enemy that by all rights should have destroyed them, they became exactly what their society had designed them to become, the incarnation of a philosophy so strong that it could face death and not break. But we should understand what that cost. The cost was that these men had been stripped of their humanity from childhood. They had been conditioned into a form of existence where fear, doubt, and mercy were considered diseases to be excised. They had been trained to see their own deaths not as tragic but as merely another tool in service of the state. And yes, that made them extraordinarily effective warriors. But it also made them something less than fully human. It made them weapons. When we celebrate the 300, we're not just celebrating courage. We're celebrating the end result of one of history's most successful programs of psychological manipulation and cultural conditioning. We're celebrating what humans can be made to do when every aspect of their identity is subordinated to an ideology. We're celebrating warriors created by a system so brutal that modern people would probably consider it a crime against humanity. That doesn't make the battle less significant. It makes it more significant because it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about what humans are capable of becoming. In the years after Thermopylae, the battle took on a life of its own. Playwrights created dramas about it. Poets wrote verses commemorating it. Sculptors carved monuments to the fallen. And slowly, the mythical Thermopylae began to overshadow the historical one. The legend became better known than the truth. The symbol became more powerful than the reality. The monument at Thermopylae itself became a place of pilgrimage. An inscription was placed there, "Go, stranger, and tell the Spartans that we lie here, obedient to their laws." That inscription is probably not authentic. It was added by later Greeks who understood the power of these words. But it crystallized something fundamental about how the battle would be remembered. The Spartans didn't die for freedom. They didn't die for democracy. They died in obedience to Spartan law. They died for Sparta. The mythmakers understood that this distinction mattered. For the Western tradition, Thermopylae became shorthand for resistance against impossible odds. It became the moment when the outnumbered few stood against the overwhelming many and refused to break. Every revolutionary movement, every resistance struggle, every underdog narrative in Western culture has been refracted through the lens of Thermopylae. It is the hero's moment par excellence. But for the ancient Greeks themselves, Thermopylae meant something slightly different. It meant that there were limits to what the great empires of the East could do. It meant that the Greek world would not simply collapse in the face of Persian power. It meant that something about Greek culture, Greek individualism, Greek innovation, Greek democracy was resilient enough to survive contact with the monolithic Persian Empire. The irony, of course, is that Sparta represented the exact opposite of the individualism that the Greeks would come to prize. Sparta was authoritarian and collectivist and militaristic. But Sparta defeated Persia, so Sparta was credited with saving Greece and its values. And in a sense, that's true. Sparta did play the central military role in the Persian Wars. Sparta did refuse to submit when submission would have been easier. But the Sparta that actually won those wars was not the individualistic, democratic beacon that Greeks would later imagine. It was something much darker. In the centuries that followed, as the Greek city-states developed democracy and philosophy and art, Sparta remained frozen in its militarism. Sparta became increasingly anachronistic. Sparta became increasingly isolated. But Sparta's reputation never changed. Sparta was forever the place where the 300 had held the pass. Sparta was forever the warrior culture that had refused to break. When we look at Thermopylae today in the 21st century, we have the luxury of distance. We can analyze the battle in ways the ancients couldn't. We can measure the numbers more carefully. We can look at the archaeology. We can examine the ancient sources critically instead of accepting them as gospel. And what we find is a battle that is real but smaller than the legend, more complex than the story, and infinitely more human than the myth. There were probably around 7,000 Greek soldiers at Thermopylae, not just 300. The Spartans probably numbered around 300 or so of the best warriors. But they were part of a coalition force that included Thespians and Corinthians and soldiers from many other Greek city-states. They all fought. They all died. The legend focused exclusively on the Spartans because Sparta had the power to shape the narrative. The battle probably lasted 3 days, but those 3 days were not 3 glorious last stands. They were 3 days of grinding, horrible warfare in a confined space. Men dying from dehydration and heat exhaustion and sword wounds. Men fighting despite mortal injuries because the formation required them to keep standing. The Persians probably didn't attack in the way the legends describe. There probably weren't wave after wave of soldiers. The fighting was probably messier and less organized than any narrative could capture. The betrayal of Ephialtes, the hidden path around the mountain, that part is real. The Persians did send soldiers to outflank the Greeks. But Ephialtes himself, was he a traitor or a pragmatic businessman? We don't know. The Greeks certainly wanted to paint him as a traitor because traitors make better stories than pragmatists. A man choosing gold over honor is a more compelling figure than a man simply accepting reality. When the Greeks realized they were surrounded, they probably didn't have some grand moment of decision. More likely, it was chaotic. Some soldiers tried to escape. Some held the line. Some probably surrendered. The accounts that come down to us emphasize honor and last stands, but the reality was probably more complicated. There were probably acts of cowardice alongside acts of bravery. There was probably panic alongside discipline. But here's what matters. Enough of the Greeks held the line long enough for other Greeks to escape. Enough of them chose to stay and face death rather than run. And that choice, whatever motivated it, ideology, fear of punishment, genuine belief in the cause, simple resignation, that choice had an impact. When the surviving Greeks brought the news of Thermopylae to the rest of Greece, they brought something more important than tactical information. They brought proof that the Persians could be hurt. They brought knowledge that Xerxes was not a god. They brought understanding that resistance was possible. And that knowledge changed everything. The naval battle of Salamis, which happened a few months later, was won by the Greeks because they believed they could win. Because they'd already seen Persian soldiers bleed. Because at Thermopylae, something had broken in the Persian mystique of invincibility. And because of that, the Greek fleet, though outnumbered, defeated the Persian fleet in the narrow waters off Salamis. And that defeat broke the back of Xerxes' invasion. Later that year, the Persians were defeated at Plataea. The invasion collapsed. Xerxes returned to Persia, his grand conquest ended. He'd won every individual battle in Greece except the psychological war. He'd lost the most important one. The Spartans would go on to dominate Greece for the next 150 years. They would become allies of Persia. They would oppress their own fellow Greeks. They would resist democracy and progress and every innovation that made other Greek city-states flourish. And they would decline into irrelevance, eventually destroyed by forces they couldn't comprehend because they'd refused to adapt or change. But Leonidas was never irrelevant. Leonidas never declined. Leonidas remained forever at Thermopylae, forever young, forever victorious in defeat, forever the embodiment of a man who chose meaning over survival. And perhaps that's the real lesson here. In a world where the Persians were trying to create a universal empire, a world where resistance seemed futile, Leonidas chose to make a symbolic stand. He chose to say that some things are worth dying for, that some principles matter more than living comfortably under an unjust rule, that there are moments when survival is less important than standing for something. That's why, 2,000 years later, his story still echoes. That's why revolutions invoke his memory. That's why philosophers and warriors and ordinary people still look at Leonidas and feel something profound. Because in choosing to die, Leonidas somehow chose to live forever. The 300 didn't save Greece. Not really. If every Spartan warrior had fled, if every Greek soldier had laid down his arms, Xerxes probably would have conquered Greece anyway. The outcome of history would probably have been slightly different, but not fundamentally altered. The Persians would have ruled Greece for a while. Eventually, someone would have challenged that rule. Eventually, Greece would have freed itself or never been conquered at all. We can't know the counterfactual. But what Leonidas and the 300 actually did was create a moment. A moment so powerful that it became the foundation myth of Western resistance. They transformed a military defeat into a spiritual victory. They took their inevitable death and gave it meaning. And they did this in a world where human beings still made sense of existence through stories. The myth of the 300 mattered more than the historical reality of 300 because myths shape civilizations. This is perhaps the darkest truth behind Thermopylae. It's not that the 300 were heroes. It's that they were human beings, complex, conflicted, conditioned by an utterly alien culture, who found themselves in a position to create a myth. And they did. And that myth became more powerful than their deaths. Their actual suffering, their actual terror, their actual sacrifice. All of it was subsumed into a legend. And that legend was used by others for purposes that Leonidas probably couldn't have imagined. The Spartans who died at Thermopylae were not fighting for freedom. They were fighting for Sparta. They were fighting for an honor code that values the collective above any individual. They were fighting for a system that had stolen them from their mothers and beaten them into weapons. But we remember them as fighting for freedom because that's the story we want to tell about ourselves. And maybe that's okay. Maybe legends are supposed to obscure the messy reality beneath them. Maybe the power of a story to inspire can justify some historical inaccuracy. Or maybe we should look at that Spartan society, brutal, totalitarian, thoroughly authoritarian, and ask ourselves whether these warriors really represent something worth celebrating. Leonidas did something real at Thermopylae. He faced death. He refused to break. He demonstrated that human beings are capable of extraordinary courage and discipline. That part is true. That part is worth celebrating. But he did it in service of a system that was dehumanizing to everyone in it. He did it because he'd been conditioned since childhood to believe that individual life was worthless. That's the dark truth that the legend erases. When we remember Thermopylae, we're not just remembering a battle. We're remembering what humans can be made to do, what a society can accomplish by completely subordinating the individual to the state, what ideology can do when it runs absolutely unchecked. The Spartans were the most successful experiment in totalitarian conditioning the ancient world had ever seen. And that's why they were such formidable warriors. That's why they could hold a pass against overwhelming numbers. But it's also why, given enough time and given enough of them, they would have been a threat to the entire Greek world. The Spartans didn't save Greece for freedom. They saved Greece from falling under the control of one empire only to eventually place it under the control of another empire.